You hear it before you see it, a sound like rolling thunder mixed with a hiss of wind through feathers. You're standing on a hillside above a dying city, and below you stretches an army so vast it looks like the earth itself has turned to flesh and steel. 300,000 men. 2 months of siege, Vienna's walls are rubble. Inside, people are eating rats and dying of plague at rates that make burial impossible. Every calculation says this is over. But behind you, 18,000 horsemen are forming a line 3 miles wide, and a Polish king with eagle feathers rising 15 feet above his armor is about to give an order that defies everything warfare is supposed to be. Before we descend into what happens next, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching this from. It genuinely amazes me that a decision made in 1683 still echoes across continents, still pulls us into the same moment of impossible choice. September 12, 1683. The hills northwest of Vienna. King John III, Sobieski of Poland, stands at the edge of a choice that will either save Christian Europe or destroy his army in a single afternoon. This isn't hindsight speaking. Contemporary letters, preserved in Polish and Austrian archives, confirm that everyone present understood the stakes. If Vienna fell, and it was days, maybe hours from falling, the road to Rome lay open. The Ottoman Empire, the superpower that had conquered Constantinople itself and ruled from Algeria to Iraq, would have broken the final barrier to Western Europe. And if Sobieski's cavalry charge failed, if 18,000 horsemen shattered against prepared Ottoman positions, the relief army would disintegrate, and Vienna would die anyway, along with everyone inside it. The man making this decision had fought Ottomans and Tatars his entire life. He'd won the Battle of Khotin in 1673, using precisely the tactic he was about to attempt again, massed heavy cavalry in overwhelming charges that broke enemy formations through sheer kinetic force. But this was different. The terrain was terrible, wooded hills that should break cavalry formations. The enemy was 3 times larger than anything he'd faced before, and he was betting everything on one roll, because there was no plan B, no fallback position, no second chance. Inside Vienna, Count Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg had no idea relief was so near. He was readying his 15,000 starving, plague-stricken defenders for a final, hopeless counterattack as the walls threatened to give way. For 2 months they had resisted an enemy 20 times their size, watching their fortifications crushed to dust by colossal siege guns and fighting in breaches with bayonets, axes, even stones when powder ran out. Accounts describe streets lined with the unburied dead, the stench of disease everywhere, and gunpowder so scarce that shots could be spent only on Ottoman officers. They had eaten horses, then dogs, then rats, and had only days left of even that. Starhemberg had smuggled messages out, begging for relief, but received no confirmation anyone was coming. For all he knew, they were dying alone while Europe watched. He didn't know that on the hills above him, the largest cavalry force ever assembled in a single charge was about to attempt the impossible. Kara Mustafa Pasha had vowed to deliver Vienna to Sultan Mehmed IV within weeks. He brought an army of 300,000, 60,000 Janissaries, taken as children and forged into unmatched infantry, Sipahi, cavalry, ferocious Delhi riders draped in animal skins, and a siege train whose bronze cannons hurled 1,000-pound stones that erased medieval walls. His advance was deliberate terror. Villages burned, tens of thousands enslaved, and at Perchtoldsdorf, 3,000 innocents executed despite promises of mercy, their bodies displayed as a warning. It worked. Panic spread through Vienna. Wealthy families fled. The poor and the soldiers stayed because they had nowhere to run. By mid-July, when the Ottomans arrived and began the systematic destruction of Vienna's walls, every rational military calculation said this was over. The defenders should have surrendered immediately. But Starhemberg knew Ottoman promises meant nothing, knew that surrender meant slavery or execution regardless. So he prepared his garrison for extinction, determined only to make it cost as much Ottoman blood as possible. The siege became a brutal equation of pressure and collapse. Ottoman artillery and miners targeted the weakened Lebel and Berg bastions, blowing open breaches and sending Janissary assault waves into suffocating close combat. Inside Vienna, bombardment shattered sleep, sanitation failed, and plague spread through the crowded city. By late August, hundreds died each day, while gunpowder dwindled so severely that Starhemberg ordered every shot to matter or not be fired at all. Contemporary letters smuggled from the city describe a population preparing for death. Not hoping for rescue, they'd moved past hope, just trying to die with some dignity intact. In the hills northwest of Vienna, a quiet miracle was unfolding. Emperor Leopold scorned for fleeing, the city had nonetheless begun assembling a relief force that required the impossible, uniting Catholic and Protestant powers in a single cause. German princes sent soldiers, imperial forces converged from several fronts, and King John III, Sobieski of Poland, bound by no treaty, compelled by no obligation, made the voluntary decision that would define his legacy and change the fate of Vienna. He understood that if Vienna fell, Poland was next. But more than strategic calculation, this was personal. Sobieski was a military genius who'd spent his life perfecting one specific tactical approach. He'd studied Ottoman warfare intimately, knew their strengths and weaknesses, and believed he could win with cavalry if he could get them onto favorable ground at the right moment. So he gathered his forces and marched toward Vienna at speeds that should have been impossible, covering ground through forced marches that exhausted his troops but got them to the battlefield before Vienna fell. By early September, the combined relief force had assembled 70,000 to 75,000 men total, with Sobieski commanding roughly 27,000 Poles, including his elite cavalry. The rest included imperial troops under Charles V, Duke of Lorraine, and German contingents from Bavaria, Saxony, Franconia, and Swabia. Sobieski, as the highest-ranking monarch present, took supreme command despite technically being on someone else's territory. His first action was climbing the Kahlenberg Heights to survey the battlefield. What he saw should have made him reconsider everything. Vienna was encircled by Ottoman siege works that stretched for miles. Sections of wall had collapsed into rubble. Smoke from constant bombardment obscured details, but it was obvious the city was on the edge of total collapse. Kara Mustafa's massive tent city, organized with Ottoman precision, looked invincible. His army appeared to outnumber the relief force 3-1. But Sobieski noticed something crucial. The Ottoman army was so confident of victory, so completely focused on the siege, that they hadn't properly fortified their camp against attack from behind. They'd left their rear exposed, reserves improperly positioned, attention fixed entirely on Vienna's walls. This was the critical Ottoman mistake. Obsession with taking Vienna quickly had made them vulnerable to exactly the kind of assault Sobieski specialized in. He spent September 11th positioning his forces with audacious precision. The plan was insane on its face, rather than a cautious approach or cutting supply lines. He would attack directly down the mountainside with the full weight of his cavalry in one overwhelming charge. The terrain was terrible for cavalry, wooded hills that would break formations, But Sobieski believed that if he could get his horsemen through the woods and onto the plain before Vienna, the psychological impact of 18,000 cavalry appearing at full charge would shatter Ottoman cohesion before the fighting even began. He positioned the Imperial and German infantry to attack the Ottoman left flank, tying down janissaries and preventing them from repositioning. The cavalry, including his precious winged hussars, would form the right wing and deliver the killing blow. The winged hussars deserved their legend. These were Poland's elite heavy cavalry, noblemen who could afford enormously expensive equipment. Each hussar wore steel breastplate and helmet, carried an 18-foot lance, multiple pistols, a saber, and most distinctively wore wooden frames on their backs, from which 15-foot-tall eagle feathers rose, creating a towering appearance that made them look supernatural. The sound of thousands of these feathers rustling as they charged was described by survivors as like thunder mixed with the roar of demons. They were trained to charge in tight formation at speeds that seemed impossible for heavy cavalry. Using the copia lance technique, where the rider absorbed the entire impact of the strike through their body, impaling multiple enemies with a single thrust, September 12, 1683 opened with a pre-dawn mass, and Sobieski declared, "I came, I saw, God conquered," echoing Caesar yet giving credit to divine will. At first light, Christian infantry clashed with janissaries, pulling the elite Ottoman troops into chaotic, overextended combat. All morning and into the afternoon, Sobieski's cavalry pushed through the wooded hills, emerging onto the plains in disciplined waves. Only then did the Ottomans grasp that a full cavalry army was descending upon them. Kara Mustafa ordered Sepahi cavalry to intercept roughly 10 to 15,000 horsemen sent to meet the Polish threat. The two cavalry forces clashed in running battles across the plain. Traditional cavalry tactics of charge and countercharge, pistol fire, and saber combat. The Ottomans were experienced, skilled warriors, but they were fighting uphill against heavier cavalry, and most critically, they were facing the winged hussars in a battle those warriors had trained their entire lives to win. At approximately 5 in the afternoon, King John III Sobieski personally led the final charge. Behind him, 18,000 cavalry spread across a 3-mile front, the largest cavalry charge in recorded history by number of horsemen. At the center, wearing their distinctive wing frames and feathers, 3,000 winged hussars. The most elite cavalry in Europe, many of them personally loyal to Sobieski, men who had followed him through decades of warfare. The order came, and 18,000 horsemen began to move, first at a walk, maintaining perfect formation, lances lowered into attack position, then trot, the ground beginning to shake from the impact of 72,000 hooves, then canter, formation still holding despite the speed, then finally full gallop, 18,000 cavalry at top speed, a wall of horseflesh and steel 3 miles wide, thundering across the plain toward the Ottoman camp. The sound was heard inside Vienna, miles away. Survivors on both sides described it as continuous thunder, mixed with the rustling roar of the hussars' wings, a sound so loud it seemed to come from the earth itself, from the sky, from everywhere at once. Ottoman defenders tried to form infantry squares, the traditional defense against cavalry, but they were already disorganized from day-long fighting, formations incomplete, flanks exposed. The Polish cavalry hit the Ottoman positions like a tsunami. The winged hussars struck first at the center, 18-foot lances impaling Ottoman soldiers 3 and 4 at a time. The impact of armored horses at full speed simply bowling over anyone in their path. Lances shattered on impact, and the hussars immediately drew sabers and pistols, continuing to cut through Ottoman ranks in wedge formations designed to split enemy units apart. The Ottoman army disintegrated with shocking speed. Veteran janissaries who had never retreated in their lives broke and ran within minutes. The Sipahi cavalry that had been fighting all afternoon couldn't stand against the weight and momentum of the Polish charge. Entire regiments dissolved into panicked mobs, fleeing back toward their camp. What had been an organized army of 300,000 men became a desperate stampede of individuals trying to save themselves. The pursuit continued for miles, Polish and Allied cavalry cutting down fleeing Ottomans from behind. A tactic considered dishonorable in European warfare, but absolutely standard in Eastern European conflicts. The slaughter was methodical, ruthless, complete. Ottoman units that hadn't even seen the charge caught the panic from fleeing comrades and joined the retreat. Kara Mustafa tried desperately to rally his forces, but the psychological shock was absolute. His soldiers had spent 2 months grinding down Vienna's walls, convinced of inevitable victory, focused entirely on the siege. The sudden appearance of 18,000 cavalry charging from the hills shattered their confidence instantly and completely. Within hours, the Ottoman camp was overrun. The Imperial and German infantry, seeing the cavalry breakthrough, pressed their assault with renewed energy. By nightfall, the Ottoman army was in full retreat. Abandoning siege works, artillery, supplies, everything in their desperate flight to escape cavalry pursuit. Inside Vienna, the turning point became unmistakable when Ottoman guns abruptly fell silent and the distant clash of battle shifted into waves of panic. Starhemberg braced for a final suicidal stand, instead ordered his garrison to surge out and strike the siege lines from within as the relief army advanced from without, starving, sick, and exhausted. Vienna's defenders dredged up strength they scarcely believed remained, hurling themselves at Ottoman positions with desperate, vengeful ferocity. After 2 months of torment, hundreds dying each day, endurance stretched to the breaking point. They finally had their chance, and they seized it without mercy. The numbers reveal the scale: 15 to 20,000. Ottomans killed versus 2 to 3,000 Christian losses, an almost unreal ratio driven by the crushing cavalry charge. But the true Ottoman disaster was strategic. The entire siege train fell into Christian hands, massive bronze cannons forged over decades, vast supply stores, and even Kara Mustafa's own treasure, intended to reward victory. Worst of all was the psychological blow. The largest invasion force in Ottoman history, led by the Grand Vizier himself, meant to seize Vienna and unlock Western Europe, was utterly shattered in a single afternoon, forcing a profound shift in Ottoman strategy forever. By September 13th, Vienna was completely relieved. Sobieski entered as a hero, greeted by crowds who literally kissed his feet. He sent a letter to his wife stating, "We came, we saw, God conquered," and wrote to the Pope describing the victory as a gift to Christianity. His reputation reached legendary status across Europe. The Winged Hussars became the most celebrated military unit of their era, their charge at Vienna mythologized in paintings, poems, and eventually films centuries later. For Kara Mustafa, the defeat was fatal. Ottoman culture demanded success from military commanders, and failure at this scale was unforgivable. He retreated to Belgrade with the remnants of his army and attempted to reorganize. But Sultan Mehmed IV sent a messenger with a silk cord in December 1683. This was the Ottoman method of executing failed officials' death by strangulation, performed by mute executioners to prevent any final words. Kara Mustafa was strangled, his body displayed as a warning, his head sent to the Sultan preserved in honey as proof of execution. The Grand Vizier, who had promised to conquer Vienna and deliver Europe to Islam, died in disgrace. The strategic consequences rippled for decades. For Poland, the victory represented the last moment of true greatness before terminal decline. Sobieski had saved Vienna and become Europe's hero. But Poland itself was surrounded by powerful enemies and would be partitioned out of existence within a century for the Holy Roman Empire. Vienna's salvation began the reconquest of Hungary and the Balkans from Ottoman control, wars that would continue until 1699. For the Ottoman Empire, Vienna marked the beginning of 3 centuries of decline, but the human cost was forgotten in the celebrations. 20,000 men died in the battle, most of them conscripted peasants on both sides who had no choice about fighting. Inside Vienna, thousands had died of starvation and disease during the siege, buried in mass graves, conveniently forgotten once victory was secure. The pursuit after the battle killed tens of thousands more, Christian cavalry, massacring Ottoman stragglers, and hunting down anyone suspected of collaboration. Villages throughout Hungary were destroyed, populations killed or enslaved by both sides. The total death toll from the Vienna campaign probably exceeded 50,000. History was written by the survivors. Polish hussars became legendary. The thousands of German infantry who died fighting janissaries in brutal close combat were forgotten. Sobieski was celebrated as savior of Europe. Emperor Leopold, who had fled Vienna in panic, was quietly rehabilitated once victory was secure. What remains is the image burned into European consciousness. 18,000 cavalry, 3 miles wide, charging down a mountainside at full gallop, eagle feathers rising above armor, the sound of thunder mixed with the rustle of wings, a wall of steel and horseflesh breaking an army 20 times its size in a single afternoon. The largest cavalry charge in human history, executed at the exact moment and place where it could change everything. The legend may be exaggerated, but the core truth remains undeniable. On September 12, 1683, a Polish king looked at 18,000 horsemen and a dying city and decided to charge directly into an army of 300,000, and he won completely. That decision, that impossible charge, that single afternoon, it ended the Ottoman threat to Central Europe forever and created a legend that 3 centuries later still makes us stop and wonder what it must have sounded like when 72,000 hooves struck the earth and 18,000 warriors roared as one. Starhemberg wrote in his diary that night, after 2 months of preparing to die, that he heard the charge before he saw it. Heard it through stone walls and cannon smoke and the fog of his own exhaustion. He wrote that it sounded like the earth itself had chosen a side, like history breaking in half, like the future arriving at full gallop with wings made of eagle feathers and lances made of steel. And for one impossible afternoon, nothing could stand against it.